Welcome everybody to Philosophy Slam! The podcast! Hello, Mark!
Hi there, Robert. Great to join you again on Philosophy Slam, the podcast, which
Exactly.
is the online version of something which we do in person as well, actually, in front of a live audience. But we're on our screens again today, Robert.
Exactly. I mean, speaking of exclamation marks, when we write Philosophy Slam, I'm always keen to have the exclamation mark in there and correct anybody who doesn't put it in, like when we do events and so on. But it always reminds me when I had a proper job back in the day, a consulting job, I had a colleague who would always add exclamation marks. So, this person would write up on a flip chart, agenda, exclamation mark, because I won't say male or female, or whatever, but their feeling was whenever you added an exclamation mark, it just added pep and energy to the proceedings. Of course, we all saw through it, but there you go, exclamation. So here we are slamming, and as is our wont on these online versions of Philosophy Slam, we don't derive our words to slam with from the audience, which is what we do when we work live. We derive them from the trusty old random word generator. And I came up with two words for us to work with. The first word delivered to us was broken. And the second word was theatre. And because it's an American random word generator, it was theatre rather than theatre. Of course, you and I, being Europeans, obviously think of theatre as being with an R-E. So broken and theatre, I can think of some links already. They're both quite rich words in all sorts of ways. Tell me your first associations, Mark, and we'll go from there.
Well, my mind with theatre immediately goes back to the ancient Greek world. You know that my sort of formal philosophical study was much to do with Plato and Plato's dialogues, and how Plato developed his form of doing philosophy in dialogues with two or more people conversing. I think against the background of one of the things that ancient Athenian society is best known for, which is its theatre. And theatre is a Greek word, I presume. It has something to do with viewing.
Yes, I
Um,
think
uh,
thein to
Yeah,
see.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, there are certainly like the Theatre of Dionysius, which you can visit in the shadow of the Acropolis in Athens to this day, with its famous semicircular seating, enabling many people. People debate, I think, quite how many people in Athens would have gone to the theatre, but nonetheless, it was a hugely important institution in particularly Athenian democracy. And the great figures during particularly the Feast of Dionysius would take their works to be performed in the theatre to be viewed. And that viewing, of course, wasn't just for entertainment. It was a religious feast when theatre was put to use. And I think that was because it was as much about viewing things with the eye of the mind, you might say, as much as with a view to entertainment. I mean, it obviously has to carry people to keep them engaged, but theatre back then, and no doubt in large part still now, was almost as much a mirror. It was like looking into a mirror that reflected back to you the state of affairs. And so plays were often performed about the wars that Athens had been involved in, and often making very sharp comment about the state of Athenian virtues. And theatre famously comes in two forms. I'll hand back to you very shortly, Robert, but just to link in this notion of brokenness or broken as well, because theatre comes usually in two forms. One is the tragedy, which is when something is irreversibly broken, you might say, but then also comedy, which isn't just played for the laughs, although sometimes it is, but more profoundly means when even that brokenness can be held by a wider whole. And so comedy can embrace tragedy, in fact, without wiping away that which has gone so wrong, but seeing things from a broader perspective. And in fact, in one of Plato's dialogues, the Symposium, it was said that at the end of all they'd been talking about in this dialogue, Socrates wanted to talk more about how comedy might embrace tragedy, as if that was a really very fundamental question, actually, to return to. No doubt, in part inspired by the institution of the theatre in ancient Athens, but the human condition more broadly too.
Fascinating. I didn't know that about comedy, as it were, encompassing tragedy, as though it were the kind of more capacious, commodious genre. And actually, that's the first place I went to as well. I was going to say something about Sophocles, which I'll come back to, but just to preview that. Yes, theatre and broken and tragedy and broken, I think, are particularly connected, because tragedy is about that which isn't yet broken but will be, as the crack, isn't it? The hamartia, the fatal flaw. There is something, rotten in the state of Denmark, and that will lead to a breakdown of some kind. So there's a kind of anticipation of brokenness, which is hinted at because of some tragic error or flaw from the past, which then comes to light in some way. But I do want to come back to that. But actually, the other thought I had was around Bertolt Brecht, the great dramatist of the German dramatist of the 20th century, who almost literally set out to break theatre, to make it broken in some way by breaking it down into its constituent parts. I mean, he's the kind of general description of Bertolt Brecht is to say he's a Marxist, or certainly kind of left-wing thinker. And for him, theatre, particularly in the European tradition, had become too bourgeois. It had become about the pleasure of the what in French they call les classes aisées, the easeful classes, the middle classes, who were just going along for a pleasant evening of entertainment that wouldn't disturb any of their luxuries or get them to think too hard about the social discrepancies from which they benefited, rich and poor, and so on. And he wanted to disrupt, I suppose, theatre, to break it apart and show that theatre was a product of labour like any other kind of service in the economy. And Brechtian theatre, not just Brecht, but Brechtian theatre takes that idea and would, for example, show you behind the scenes. There wouldn't always be scenery in front of what's going on. Props and so on would be shown in a raw estate. Actors, you might see the entrance and exits and a bit behind the scenes as well. So that mystification that's involved in theatre, what Marx called fetishization of commodities, where today, we'll buy a commodity but don't really know where it comes from. That fetishization, that mystification of commodities, something that applies to theatre all the more because it's about appearance and hides the labour that's gone into producing it, represents a sort of Marxist intervention that breaks theatre from its kind of bourgeois illusions, I suppose. If you want a contemporary version, I mean, I'm listen to a lot of music. There's a famous film of Talking Heads, the kind of post-punk New York band led by David Byrne. The film was called Stop Making Sense. And the film is not a regular concert of a concert where you just have a camera in front, watching people play their instruments and so on. But when David Byrne first comes on stage, it's just him, not the rest of the band. He walks on. The stage is completely bare. You see all of the kind of wires at the back of the stage. There's no set whatsoever. He just comes on with a guitar and a drum machine. And then they gradually build. They then bring in the bassist, they then bring in the drummer until it's a complete set. But it's sort of in the same tradition of deconstructing the illusions of theatre and showing that it's made up of constituent parts like any material process, actually.
And I wonder whether there's a spiritual element to that, because this link between tragedy and comedy, I think one of the ways of understanding Shakespeare is that, of course, he writes tragedies, he writes comedies, but then he adds a third genre, slightly confusingly, I think, called romances, where the idea isn't that people fall in love, but that there's some sort of intervention from a third dimension that provides the healing. So Shakespearean romances would be A Winter's Tale, for example, where there is a terrible tragedy and no comedy can put together partly the breakdown of the friendship between the two main characters, but of course people have died as a result of the tragedy as well, and so they can't be brought back to life. But there is the famous scene towards the end of A Winter's Tale in which a statue comes to life of the main character's wife. And it's as if we need to lean into something from another dimension altogether after things are completely broken. And maybe this is, now I'm thinking on the top of my head, as happens in philosophy slam, but maybe this is actually quite a deeply Christian notion that brokenness, even absolute brokenness in death, isn't actually the end of the story, but might even be seen as a precursor to something completely new and unexpected erupting. And so when life is viewed from the transcendent perspective, other possibilities might emerge as well. And I just wonder whether in our time, where there's been so much focus on deconstruction, like you're suggesting, and the sense that we've all become so kind of wise that we understand how everything works, and everything in a way is just surface now. Whether there is a kind of yearning to say, no, we've misunderstood that actually in the push to expose the workings, the wires, like you're saying, the staging, and that maybe that's putting the human too much to the fore, as if we're living in some sort of isolated world where we can make everything up if we choose to do so, and are losing the sense of, well, what the ancient Greeks would have called, or what gets called any of the deus ex machina, normally sniffed at now as if something is so broken that a god just appears from the skies and fixes it as if by magic. But I'm inclined to feel that actually that's a true insight about the nature of reality. That when the human isn't regarded as the sum total of all that is, capable of putting together and taking apart almost at will, that's to fall back onto a deeper reality. And so the brokenness of theatre might even lead to a wider view of things once again.
Gosh, that's absolutely fascinating. And I was going to make the link with another use of theatre, as in operating theatre, where broken bodies are brought in to be fixed. And when you said there your thoughts about the Deus ex machina, and for those who don't know that phrase, Deus ex machina, it's a very peculiar phrase, really. It's a Latin phrase. God from a machine is how you would literally translate it. Very peculiar. But it's the idea of kind of God descending and intervening and, yeah, fixing what's broken in some way, restoring things that human beings have messed up. And in the process, alluding to a space that's beyond the human, that humans can't access except by the grace of God in some way. And it made me think, gosh, lying on the operating theatre with a surgeon looming over you, the surgeon is a kind of deus ex machina, isn't it? Because there's something about being broken, which means you are supine or low, literally and metaphorically lying down normally when you're broken. But the figure of the surgeon, and we know, lots has been said about the God complex of surgeons and doctors and so on, that they are some entitled God on earth because they can heal people in this uh, godlike, or even perhaps even Christ-like way, and restore brokenness in some way. But so I love what you say there. I wonder if there's another take on it as well, and maybe also in a Christian tradition, because I was thinking about moral breaking, as in sin, things we've done wrong. And obviously in the Christian tradition, we want the sins to be washed away. We've just had Christmas, so there's, I've been to lots of services, and there's lots about the sins being washed away and us being absolved and so on. But there's another take on that, I think, which is brokenness is also, as scar tissue, what makes us who we are. We have, you've just written this amazing book on William Blake, and it makes me think of Innocence and Experience in William Blake, where he talks about the value of experience and the value of losing innocence as well. I mean, his thoughts are complex on this subject, so it's not like one is better than the other. Both have their their merits, but there's something about the experience and brokenness which suggests actually we have lived and we have made mistakes. And yes, we may then wish to call out for a God to come and intervene and sort things out for us, but nevertheless, not necessarily with a view to going back to how things were before. It's sort of accepting the sin, the brokenness, and kind of working with it or building upon it, because that's mistakes are on the path to growth. It sounds a bit sappy to say it like that, but they kind of are.
No, there is the tradition in Christian mysticism of what is known as the felix culpa. We're getting Latin phrases coming in thick and fast now, but and this is the happy fault. So it's the idea that originally in the myth, when Eve ate the apple, this wasn't ultimately a tremendous fall, but actually was part of the divine plan, and that happy fault would lead to a kind of, well, innocence in the way that Blake liked to talk about, actually, which he always said that innocence dwells with wisdom and not with ignorance. So it's a capacity to say yes to life, even in its brokenness. And that leads to a much fuller sense of things. And I know that whether is there some link here that my mind went to when you were talking about theatre as well, and how in an age where so much is available to us online, listening to something live or viewing, to remember theatre in its original meaning again, viewing something live is energizing. And so, with music, for example, um, the success of live music concerts in an age of music being streamed everywhere is saying something about how the human spirit gains from that presence. And even in a podcast like this, I wonder whether part of what goes on with the slamming side of it is that neither of us know what's going to emerge over these minutes that we're speaking. And maybe that spontaneity, I hope it does actually, communicates to listeners as well. And so there's a sense of exploring the terrain that opens up for us when we pick these two words, that is invigorating, it is spiriting. And even though it's not polished, you can see the brokenness of the surfaces that we're moving across, you might say, the cracks at least. That actually makes it feel much more vigorous than as if we produced two essays on the words that come up, broken and theatre in this case. That might be informative in some way, but it wouldn't quite have the vitality, I think. Yeah, so maybe these words are even telling us about what we're doing now.
What you say there, Mark, takes me in a pretty metaphysical direction. So bear with me on this, because you talked there about theatre and presence and the kind of vivifying effect of the theatre and the kind of being there of theatre. And I'm trying to write this stupidly ambitious book on the field and the nature of reality. And one of the things I'm trying to write about in a reasonably cogent way is the nature of time. And so bear with me on this. It seems to me one definition of time is what always breaks itself. It never forms, because it's always losing itself in order to allow things to manifest. Because if time solidified, as it were, brought things to a stop, nothing could happen. So time has this strange quality of self-loss. It has to kind of give itself away. It's pure self-abandonment or pure brokenness in a way. So time has to be that which breaks itself in order for things to appear. It has to move every present moment into the past. It has to dissolve everything that comes towards it, as it were. It's a pure function almost of brokenness. And that makes me think, actually, the nature of presence, what we call, you just used the word presence there, the nature of presence is probably a little different from how we normally think of it. We think of presence as everything is here, everything is there. But it could be that it's sort of the opposite, that presence is more the experience of loss. When everything gets taken away and we're in time, that's what presence is about. It's more a feeling of loss than gain. It's more a nothing is here, and so I can be. And being is the experience of just pure transience, rather than assembling into these moments of coherence of one kind or another, which I think is a bit connected with how kind of meditation works and maybe some kind of Buddhist ideas on letting go and detachment and so on. But as you can tell, these thoughts of mine are only half formed at best. But there's something about the theatre of presence as broken time. Sounds a horribly abstract thing to say, which kind of interests me there.
No, I think there is something in that. In Buddhist circles, there's talk about how form is emptiness and emptiness is form. And I think that you would get something similar in Christian mysticism. I'm very influenced by a book called The Cloud of Unknowing by an anonymous author, but certainly too, the idea is that everything goes into the cloud of forgetting all that we feel we know, and then you're able to sit before the cloud of unknowing, as the author puts it, using a different metaphor from form and emptiness. But I think there's a parallel there, this sense that presence, at least in a sort of first move, is a kind of emptying, and then that being, when it's better known, can be appreciated in all that is as well. But there is a kind of twofold movement, form and emptiness, or forgetting and unknowing. And then, as you're saying, presence being quite intimately related to absence, strangely enough, in the theatre of life. So that metaphysical trace that you're picking up there, I think, is something that certainly has been reflected on quite substantially.
Mm. Well, that's absolutely brilliant, Mark. We should draw things to a close and make ourselves absent from this podcast. Thank you for listening to this theatre of ideas, where we've broken words down into their constituent elements and
And
given
even
ideas.
flirted with language breaking down altogether, it feels like, but hopefully to produce a new kind of vitality.
Exactly so. Yeah. So thanks for listening. Please do all those good things that digital citizens these days must do, which is liking, subscribing, commenting, sharing, etc. You know the drill. Please help us to grow this podcast so that Mark and I can fill out huge theatres and not be broken by the experience. So thank you very much, Mark.
See you next time.